Welcome to Leadership Where It Matters Most. The family is the most important institution in the world. The future of the church passes through the family. The church has the greatest mission of any organization ever. Go and make disciples of all nations. The family and the church. This is where leadership matters most. Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to Leadership Where It Matters Most. It is a real honor and a privilege for me to be journeying with you in this way. Thanks for subscribing. Thanks for sharing. It's a joy. Today's guest is Warren Smith. Warren has built one of Canada's top executive search firms specializing in the legal industry. He has offices in Vancouver, in Calgary, and Toronto. And his firm is at the heart of legal recruitment, working with leading law firms and in-house legal departments right across the country. Warren is one of the most senior, and I would say most well-connected legal recruiters in Canada. He has been directly involved in the expansion of multiple U.S. law firms into our country and has played a key role in numerous high-profile group moves right across this country. Warren is the only Canadian recognized in the Law Dragon Global 100 Leaders in Legal Strategy and Recruiting, which is a prestigious guide that recognizes the most influential consultants in that industry. He's also the only Canadian to have ever served as president of the National Association of Legal Search Consultants, which is the leading industry association for legal recruiters across North America. I believe Warren was voted both top 30 under 30 and top 40 under 40 in his time. And he's also a friend. And so Warren and I had the privilege of traveling together. I was his guest to London, England, to attend the Association of Responsible Citizenship Conference, otherwise known as ARC, which is headed up by Dr. Jordan Peterson. So Warren and I have a wonderful conversation. I invite him to share, some of the most important things and titles, if you will, that he holds in his life, the roles that he holds in his life. He talks a little bit about the local initiative here with the St. Thomas More Guild. He tells us a little bit about his professional and academic journey, which was quite interesting. And I've known a lot about Warren, but I didn't know some of the things. So that was even interesting for me, who knows him pretty well. We talk about some of the biggest lessons that he's learned, some of the harder lessons that he's learned in business ownership and leadership. We do talk a little bit about ARC and, the experience of ARC, but also beyond ARC, like what is happening? What are the global movements around the world right now? And we had to actually pause there because I had a number of other questions, but it was so animated that we had to pause. So it got cut short as far as I'm concerned. So I want to have Warren back on the podcast very soon. So enjoy this episode with Warren Smith. Warren Smith, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to this. So I always invite guests at the beginning of the show to just kind of introduce themselves, but I wanted to do this in a unique way with you. So I'm posing to you, Warren, what are 5 things that the listeners need to know? When they know these 5 things, they get the essence of who you are. What would you say?
Sure. 5's a long list in my mind. I'm fascinated that there might be 5 interesting things about me, but let's dive into it, see what we come up with. I think obviously, at the top, I'm a Catholic, but I'm a convert. And I think as the Archbishop has told me on a few occasions, there's no zealot like a convert. So I came into the faith. My wife was raised Catholic. She had said when we were talking about, going to church as a married couple, she said famously, you can go to any church you want as long as it's Catholic. And so therein ended the discussion on where we might go.
Yeah.
That's probably, the starting point for any conversation, I think. I think I'd probably say that the second thing is I'm a father of 4 lovely kids who are quickly, maybe almost too quickly approaching adulthood. My eldest is off to university. I've got 3 more coming up. It seems like every other year, I think, for the next little bit.
Yep.
So I think those are obviously 2 very strong pillars in my world. That's kind of where I would start the conversation. In terms of other things, I would say I'm trained as a lawyer, but I'm an entrepreneur in the business that sort of runs parallel to the legal profession. So I own a national executive search firm that focuses on lawyers and lawyer hiring and sort of talent issues related to the legal industry. I would say the 4th thing is I have a unhealthy obsession with things that go fast, cars specifically. I'm a big fan of F1, a big fan of cars and racing. and maybe sort of fits with a bit of my adrenaline junkie, short attention to detail, sort of hyper-focused personality that's born out of having ADHD. But it's certainly one of my passions in life, and one of the things that if I have an opportunity to spend some free time on, it's usually one of the two: cars or watching cars. So, I would say that's the other thing, just on the personal side. And then I think, and it's probably true of a lot of facets of my life, it probably is most prominent on the business side right now, but you can see it in a lot of stuff. And it does kind of build on the ADHD part of my brain, but I'm a big systems guy. And I think that if you were to ask, what has been a root cause of my success in business, I would say a lot of it has to do, I think a lot about my world in, can I build better systems for the people that I work with, for the clients that I work with, and how I think about questions sort of just generally. So I would say those are probably sort of the 5 things, if you were. I'm sure I've butchered and missed some other stuff. I trust that my wife fits into the first conversation on She's Who Brought Me to God. And so, I like to think that those are the kind of the big things. So family guy, Catholic, love cars, lawyer to begin with, now running a business. Like to think that business is built on a foundation of good systems and good people.
That's awesome. Thanks, Warren.
Yeah.
You're a very unique individual, but there's one thing I think that's not unique to your story, which is that your wife strongly influenced you in your faith, which is great. Good testimony to her.
Yeah, no, for sure.
Now, one thing you didn't mention, which I'm familiar with, is that you're very heavily involved sort of locally here in Vancouver with the St. Thomas More Guild for Catholic lawyers, and you serve as the chair of that. So maybe you can just say a couple words about that.
Yeah, for sure. So the St. Thomas More Lawyers Guild is a guild that exists in, I think, most of the provinces and certainly around the world. And it's typically to help with fellowship for those in the legal profession or those that are, sort of involved in the law, in an area. And so for us, we focus on the British Columbia community of lawyers and judges. We gather periodically through the course of the year. Sort of the big marquee event for us is we do a dinner every year and a Red Mass. Typically occurs in the fall. And so that's been sort of one of the projects that I've had the sort of good fortune to be a part of. It's one of those things that Father Horgan was very involved in helping us to sort of bring together at first instance. He was the person that sort of had suggested a few of us. It's something that had been not as active in the community in the Archdiocese. And so it actually occurred shortly after Archbishop Miller's installation here in Vancouver. And so I had an opportunity to meet with him. There's a few other folks that were very involved in sort of getting us up and off the ground. Bruno DeVita is a very senior practitioner and, sort of preeminent King's Counsel lawyer here in Vancouver. We famously met at a white spot that no longer exists to sort of chat about sort of putting this all together. And so we've been very fortunate. We've had, cardinals come and speak. We've had judges from the Supreme Court of Canada speak. We've had, some very prominent leaders in the business community. There's been a good range of personalities. And, sort of the common thread is the intersection of faith and the profession. I think for me, a lot of what I've enjoyed about it is it's created an opportunity for fellowship for Catholic lawyers in the community. I've had moments where partners at large law firms did not even know that their other partners at their firm were Catholic. And I think it's one of the things I've observed as a Catholic faith is a very quiet faith. It's not something that shouts itself from the rooftops. It goes about living its life as Catholics. And one of the challenges sometimes with that is that we don't always know who the other Catholics are in the room at all times. And so hopefully that's maybe, one of the great things that's come out of it is that we've had a chance to meet each other and talk about our faith and talk about that faith journey in the context of the professional law.
Yeah, that's awesome. Many a times, I'm sure lawyers have looked at each other at the Red Mass and said, "What are you doing here?"
Yeah.
Which is great because you're providing that opportunity for fellowship and whatnot.
Yeah.
Father Paul Scalia, son of Antonin Scalia, was your last guest speaker, right?
Yeah.
He was on the podcast, so good friend.
Yeah.
I want to just follow up on one thing because you talked about sort of the adrenaline junkie. Didn't set you up for this question, but I'm curious, like the need for speed, does that translate in other things like bungee jumping and cliff diving and all that kind of stuff? Are you made for that?
Not at all.
No, I'm a lawyer too, right? Yeah, exactly.
I don't know. For whatever reason, I think that I've always loved cars. I think it's just kind of, maybe it's just the, sort of the boy in me. I would say one of the things that honestly put me back to school, I began my life working in bars and restaurants, actually. So after high school, I did not go on to university. A very impatient personality, wanted to go out and see the world, make some money, do some stuff. I was, working in like Denny's restaurants and things like that. And I remember this would have been back in 1995, I think. The Corvette C5 came out. I remember seeing the Car and Driver with that car, sort of on the front of the magazine. And I remember crunching numbers and thinking, I'm never going to be able to afford this car,
Mm.
making what I'm making now. And that's a weird kind of, sort of, thing to think about at that, age and stage of life. But that like really stuck with me because I was kind of stuck, and I was like, I thought I was working hard. I was like a, very young restaurant manager at the time. And I was like, it doesn't matter what I do. I'm never going to be able to get to that. And shortly after that, I ended up going back to school. And I was like, there were other factors at play at the time, but it was a big one for me. It's just kind of been one of those things that's, stuck with me as it's something I love. I don't know why, I find cars are beautiful art.
Mm.
And I love racing. And I've come to really love F1. And so it's just kind of one of those things that has fit. And there's not really, I'm actually in most other ways, a fairly cautious personality. Like you could not pay me enough money to, go bungee jumping. My wife's gone skydiving. There's no chance I would ever do that in my view.
Wow.
Right. So
yeah,
no, it's, I think it's very, very specific to cars. I think it's maybe less to do with the speed and more to do with just, I love the idea of cars generally.
Yeah, that's great. So cars motivated you to go back to school. So why don't we segue that into, just tell us about your academic and professional journey. Like, how did you end up where you are?
A lot of good grace, a lot of good fortune, a little bit of hard work. I went back to school originally having worked for a number of years. So I went back to a community college. At the time, I was living out in Eastern British Columbia in Cranbrook. So I did a couple of years of college. And then from there, I was actually going to go to the University of Calgary. And more as a footnote, I'd grown up in Burnaby, but I was living out in the Kootenays at the time. And so I'd put an application in to SFU more just sort of on an autopilot. Well, I should probably put something in there. Never thought anything about it. Got the acceptance at the University of Calgary. And I get a call shortly after from the admissions department at SFU. And they asked how come I hadn't applied for a scholarship. And I didn't have the heart to tell them that I wasn't really particularly serious about going to their university.
Yeah.
And so I'd said, I must have missed it or something, to that effect. And they said, well, do you think you could put a package together? You've got some pretty strong grades. You might be able to get some scholarship for that. And so I scrambled about and wrote a letter and got one of my profs to, send a letter along, and didn't think much of it. And then probably about a month later, I got a package in the mail, and they offered me one of their 3 President's Scholars. It was a full ride scholarship. It was like tuition. It was residence, the whole 9 yards. It was basically free tuition, like free education. And so like literally on that, my whole life changed. And I was, my brother lives in Calgary. Like the direction from Cranbrook far and away is to go to Alberta, not to Vancouver.
Right.
But just on that one event was a massive, sort of turn in a different direction. And that's kind of how we ended up in Vancouver. And so I did my undergrad at SFU in political science. Like everybody coming to the end of a poli-sci degree, what do you do with one of those? I had a bunch of friends that were in poli-sci that were going to write this thing called the LSAT. I didn't really know. I don't have any lawyers in my family. And so I kind of last minute audibled and wrote the exam with them. I think I looked at one kind of before, just kind of had it looked like a word game or sort of puzzle. And I was the only guy that got in. So they were not very happy with me because
much to their delight. Yeah, exactly.
I was like, so the guy that was like, oh, okay, sure, I'll do it with you guys. He got in and nobody else did. And so that's how I ended up in law school. And I actually, at the time, when I got the admission letter, I wasn't actually even sure I wanted to go. So I phoned them. I'm like, do I have to can I defer this? Can I go maybe next year? Because I wasn't really sure I wanted to go. And I think they looked at me like I'd sprouted a third eye out of my forehead because they're like, no, like when you get in, you take the offer.
Yeah.
You can't defer it. And they famously said, look, just come for a year. And if you don't like it, you can go back and do a master's or go do a PhD or do something else. But for anybody who's been to law school, I think you all know that basically once you're in, it's a tractor beam. It just kind of pulls you right to the finish line. So that's how I ended up in law school. And so then
Wow.
went to law school. I had the good fortune of very good grades in law school, got recruited to one of the big law firms, began my career there. I liked it, but didn't love it. I think sort of as a result of that, started thinking about what other things maybe you can do. They tell you there's lots of things you can do with a law degree in law school. I'm sure that's probably correct, but certainly as a articling student, sort of young associate, it wasn't clear to me where those options were.
Yeah,
And
right.
so, I ended up chatting with a bunch of recruiters. I had friends that were a little bit, more senior to me. They were, in other careers, some in law, but some in like, finance or other sort of professional services. And, they all said, hey, well, I have a recruiter that helped me sort of at this stage of my career. Why don't you chat with them? And I went and met with a bunch of these recruiters. And it was kind of eerie because like every single one of them, probably about 20, 30 minutes into the conversation, invariably said, you should think about a career in recruitment. You've got the right sort of temperament, right disposition. Yeah. So one thing led to another. A number of them then invited me back to come and interview at their shop. And one of them actually placed me into my first firm that I started into the industry with. So that's kind of how I got to, sort of working as a restaurant manager in Cranbrook to starting a career in law and then ultimately becoming a recruiter.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
I mean, just going back to the earlier days, like, were you a strong student in high school as well? Or did that kind of flip a switch when you went to community college even?
I would describe myself as the smartest, laziest person that I could possibly be. I'd skipped a grade in elementary school. So I was actually born late in the year and was actually 15 when I started grade 12.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So at the time, and this is going back quite a ways now, you, I think, could get into university with something approaching a B or B plus, sort of average, right? Wild statement today, watching my daughter's academic requirements to get into university, let me tell you. But back then, and so like I had kind of mathed it out that there was really no differentiation in the high school system between, at the time, if I remember correctly, like a B was 73 and an A was 86. And I was and I remember going, well, I just need to get 73. I can do that in my sleep.
Yeah.
So,
Right.
My transcript was pretty much like spot on the money, like B's across the board. And I may have gotten an A in, social studies or something like that. And I just found the line. And that summed up a lot of my strategy back then in life. And I'm watching my sons do the same thing because they have the same brain. And, whereas my daughters actually have like good discipline and actually have great marks. I'm a little bit nervous. My boys are a little too close to home for my liking, but here we are. I would say I was, and then maybe this kind of ties back to the systems thing. I like to look at systems and sort of figure out what's the optimal line. That makes sense.
Yeah.
And so there was a little bit of that. So when I went back to school, I would say, much more man on a mission. I think that I felt I was playing from behind. I'd been sort of working for, I guess, probably about 4 years at that point. And I felt I was really sort of behind the eight ball and I had to really kind of put my back into it, try to sort of make up for some lost time. So I think that work ethic and application in school really only showed up, once we went back. But it was certainly I wouldn't have said it was there coming up through high school, if that makes sense. Yeah,
no, it makes sense. Timestamp this, like when you started in your first recruitment firm, what year was that?
That would have been 2003, 2004. Yeah.
And did you know right away, like as soon as you were in that environment with that organization, did you know this is it? This is great. I see how it aligns with who I am, how I think, what moves me, that kind of motivates me.
I think it would be easy to say yes. And I think certainly if you talk to any of my friends, colleagues, spouse, I think everybody said, oh, that job makes way more sense for you, Warren. Just sort of having an understanding of like what I liked, what I was good at, what I naturally gravitated towards. I think those early years make a lot more sense in retrospect than in the moment, if that makes sense. I remember grappling with, how is that, sort of role going to come into focus for me, sort of leaving law, behind. Like there were moments there in the first few years where I certainly had wondered whether, because I'd put a lot of time into going to law school and, I had done well in law. And so you definitely kind of have moments along that way where you think, well, you know, am I really doing this, instead of law? And I think that in retrospect, unquestionably, that was the right move for me. And it definitely played to a lot more of my strengths. But I think if I'm being really honest about that stage in my life, I would say I was definitely happier in
Mm.
recruitment than I was in law. But I think you still are going to ask that question along the way because it's a very significant departure, right? And so I think for
Hmm.
me now, I would say unquestionably that was the easy answer. That was far and away the best. And I don't know. I've often said to people, I think I would have been a good lawyer, but I've been a great recruiter.
Right.
And I think that's maybe it would have been true. I mean, I like to think I've got a good enough discipline to sort of push through had I stayed in law. But I definitely had the discipline and the push through because I enjoy the elements of recruitment more. It's a fascinating question I get to, sort of grapple with every day.
Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah. Yeah. I didn't set you up for this, so hopefully you can respond to it. But I'm curious about the season when you were contemplating going out on your own,
Yeah.
Which many people do. And some it's a wonderful ride full of ease and butterflies and rainbows. And
Yeah.
other people, it's hard. What was the experience like for you? What was it like in preparation? Was it an easy decision? You just go for it? Did you really wrestle with it? Just talk a little bit about that.
Probably the most difficult decision I've made in my life. Probably the
Wow.
most important decision I've made in my life as well. I think that I'm a very cautious person by nature when it comes to the big decisions, right? And I think that I felt there were a lot of facets of my life that I really needed to think about. I had 4 kids at the time, I had a mortgage, I had staff that, relied on the revenues that I was producing to pay for their families.
Mhm.
So it definitely wasn't an easy decision. I think about it was something that I probably had running around in the back of my head. I think if you asked my wife, she would have said it's something you probably should have done 5 years earlier. But, things happen on a particular timeline for a reason, right? And in retrospect, I wish I had done it sooner, but who knows if I would have been ready to do it sooner, right? So I think it was one of those questions that have been running around in the back of my head. I had in my last shop, I had come into that business. So I owned the last firm that I was with 2 other folks. And we had taken it over from the founder of that firm. And so in some ways, almost a little bit like an arranged marriage. Like these were business partners that I kind of inherited as we had taken over the business from the former founder. And they're good people. And I think that, they were trying to build a vision or a version of the business that worked for them. And I was trying to build a version of the business that worked for me. And we didn't always agree on where we wanted to go and what we wanted to build. And it's tricky. And a thing I learned sort of after the fact is a 3-person partnership is one of the most challenging partnerships to navigate because inevitably 2 end up, on one side and one ends up on the other. And it's fine if the 2 and 1 sort of rotates amongst the 3. But I think that more often than not, and certainly I think by the end, it was a very clear sort of there was 2 on one side and me on the other. And it's tough because you've kind of gone through a long journey with these people. Like I'd worked with them for 15, 16 years, right? Like
Wow.
that had been my world. And I think it just kind of without getting sort of into the details of the divorce, so to speak, it just, I think you kind of got to a point where it was like, we really were on different paths and different journeys in our lives. And so it's, I've said to people, like, there's a lot of elements of like going through a divorce. I think I've never been through one, never will be, so it's kind of one of those things that I think has those elements, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think that was what made it difficult is I put a lot of time and effort, at least from my perspective. And I think they did too, to try and sort of figure out how to navigate that. But you kind of reach a point where you're like, we kind of keep hitting the same walls. And so I think that, in some ways the pandemic really focused that for us because this all happened around the time that sort of the pandemic was playing out.
Mm.
And so it kind of became clear at that point that we really were kind of on different journeys. And so that's kind of, how it all came together. So, I mean, it was, I don't know. I mean, it's been 5 years, a little over, I guess, sort of, since that fork in the road, but it was a big one for sure. And I think that certainly from my perspective, it will go down in my life as one of the sort of the seminal moments, one of the key moments. Like if somebody ever, were to write a book about my life, why they would, but if they did, for sure that would be a chapter.
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, we're kind of hovering around this, but I'm just curious, over the years, not only have you done some amazing things, but you're a reflective guy too. So you think about things,
I try.
Socrates said the unexamined life is not worth living. So you've examined your life. So as you've contemplated all the things that you've experienced and done and accomplished, what are some of the bigger lessons that you've learned as a leader?
Ooh, big question. Big question, Brett. I think on the leader front, I think a lot of what I think about is everybody is on their journey. I have very little hard power in people's lives, in my view. And maybe that's just a sort of a personal philosophy thing, and maybe it's sort of it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, but I've been strongly of the view that I really can't make anybody do anything. It's really not in my power. I've watched people I've worked with in the past who, use authority to achieve outcome, and it's rarely lasting.
Yeah.
And I think I spend a lot of my time thinking about the people that I work with, the people that, work for me, and really trying to understand where are they coming from and where is their journey trying to go? And are we in alignment? Like where are we trying to go somewhere together? And what might that look like? And can I help you get there? And, I've had people that have worked with me over the years, and I have had discussions with them where I've said, look, like I'm going to do my best to get you where you want to go, even with where you want to go isn't where I'm going. And I've taken a lot of pride in. I've had, people that have worked with me that have gone on to phenomenal careers, that have, frankly outgrown the roles that they've been with me in. And, based on sort of where the company was at, we couldn't get them where they wanted to go. And so I've worked with them to sort of get where they needed to go. And they're still friends of mine today. And I've been very fortunate. I've had virtually no turnover. I've had no turnover on my team since we've started the shop. Like everybody that's come with me, still with me. I was very blessed that everybody that, I wanted to come with me is still with me. I like to think that that's, one of my superpowers is I really do spend time with people to see where we're trying to go together. And if I can help you get there, let's go. And so I think for me, that's a big part of how I think about, what I build, who I build with, how I build with. I spend a lot of time trying to figure out, are we cut from similar cloth? And I think that that's a very important part of how I just approach life generally. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Is that like an intuitive thing for you, Warren? Or is there like literally a preset list of these are the issues that if we don't have alignment on, I know for a fact we're not on the same page?
I would say I actually think that's where God shows up in my life. I think that that's really, if you were to really boil it down, I would say it's probably the question I pray on and reflect on and think about and try and hear God.
Yeah.
And I think that it's probably more likely that someone who shares a faith background, and I'm not even sure it's a Catholic background per se, but I think that exercise of reflecting on living a life that's not just about yourself, right? I think that's one of the great teachings that God offers is you're living a life that is not for you, right? Like your human nature is going to pull you towards yourself. We all are built with that, fatal flaw. But I think that going through that exercise of reflecting on who you are, what's your role, what does God want for you, I think if you are able to listen to it, and I fail at listening to it all the time, but I try. I think if you listen for that, it's easier to hear it and help other people hear it in their world as well. That makes sense?
Yeah. Yeah, it does. You may not remember this, but when you and I had some time when we were in London, because we're Canadian, England, you have to distinguish that, which you talked about. I said to you that it was neat for me to experience you in that kind of environment because the opportunity to interact with people was just everywhere. I mean, 5,000 people at this conference. And one of the things I appreciated is that you get very quickly to a level of conversation where it's not, two posers networking, over coffee, but it's two human beings who are being, quite real,
Yeah.
not like awkwardly so, but you get to that level very quick. And now I'm seeing there's a motivational factor there. Like you're really trying to see, is there opportunity for mutual added benefit here? Is there a way to help and all the rest?
Yeah.
So that's another layer of understanding how you operate in that environment. So that's great.
Yeah. I try. It's a journey. Like we're all on it together. I think it's kind of one of the great questions humans grapple with in life, right? Like you're always in this tension between your self-interest and the better interest, right? We're not perfect. But I think it's, to your point, like I think if you try and you at least kind of are as best you can self-aware of the journey you're on, I think it's much more likely you'll find it than not. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And, I think that my general philosophy on those kind of large scale social interactions, I think you and I talked about this a little bit, is I think of those as I'd rather have 3 really interesting conversations than 20 surface conversations. And I think that I'm honestly, a lot of it I think is rooted in I don't actually think I'm very good at small talk. Like very surface level conversation is not something that I find very appealing. I'd rather just jump into it. I think my wife has, sort of made that comment to me a few times, or sometimes I might be better to slow it down just a little bit than like go to right to the, like, tell me your life story, right?
Yeah.
But I just I find that like the human experience is such a fascinating one, right? And people are living these really, really interesting lives, all around us. One of the speakers at ARC was, Dr. Jordan Peterson. I remember a podcast or an interview he had given where he had said, like, if you don't find the person you're speaking with interesting enough, you are not trying hard enough.
Yeah.
Yeah. That is like, there is not a person on earth that isn't grappling with something that isn't deeply fascinating. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. I forget who said it. It's, one of the leadership gurus that I might follow, whatever, but he had a mentor that said something to him that was very cutting, but very true. And he said, you're spending the majority of your time in these environments trying to be interesting, but what you should be is interested in the other person, right? And when you are, it's fascinating. Curiosity will lead you to realize how nuanced, textured, magnificent every single person you lock eyes with is, because they've got a story, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely. So, Warren, is there another lesson maybe that you want to speak to, things that you've learned, maybe even a humbling one or something difficult? If not, we can jump into ARC and we can go there, but I want to give you the opportunity.
Yeah. Humbling lessons in life. I mean, geez Louise, it happens on a daily basis. What are the big humbling lessons? I'd have to reflect on that one, I think, probably a little bit longer. I think there's a lot of things where, what can I do better in life? Where can I be better in life? I think a lot of it just comes from the role as a leader in a group. And I think that it is very easy to miss cues on people when you are trying to fit the world to your agenda. That makes sense? And I have, I've had a few people that have not worked out, over 25 years. And I remember one of the coaches that I was chatting with said that if you have to let somebody go or somebody leaves your team and both sides or one side didn't see it coming, like if it's a surprise, a mistake was made, right?
Right.
I think about that because I've had, 2 folks where I've had to let them go and one where they quit early in my career. And I would say in both instances, there were really good lessons on I wasn't listening or I wasn't communicating or both.
Right.
And I think that, if I were to say what's the biggest, sort of question or focus of my life right now, it has been on a work side, honestly, in a life side. I'm really interested in getting to understand the way things are, not the way things ought to be or hope to be or wish to be. I really want to see things as best I can for what they are. Because if I understand what they are and where they are, then I feel like you can actually have a real discussion around like where we want to go, right? But if I have a delusion about I think I'm a really good leader, or I think, you're not working hard enough, or this team isn't focused enough, or, I'm doing things that are, sort of aspirational, but not anchored in reality. That's where a lot of strain, a lot of stress, a lot of pain comes in the world. Right. And so back to your comment on like, be more interested.
Mm.
That's a lot of my thinking, a lot of my reading, a lot of my reflection, a lot of my prayer is I want to better see how the world is first.
Yeah.
And until I'm doing that well, I feel like everything else is a lot less valuable. That makes sense? Because
Yeah.
if you can't anchor your world in what is, it's very hard to discuss what ought to be or what could be. Because
Yeah.
you don't have a start point. So there's no reference.
Yeah.
That makes sense?
Oh, absolutely. And it's echoing the words of Jim Collins. Are you a Jim Collins fan? Good to
Yeah.
great.
Yeah.
Because he talks about this, right? He, a lot of us, especially in the leadership space, you want to talk about a picture of the preferred future, it's visionary and all that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But if you don't know exactly where you are, and in the language of Jim Collins, he calls it, confront with brutal honesty current reality,
100%.
you will not be able to make progress because you don't have the right starting point. So absolutely, I agree 100%. Let's talk about ARC a little bit,
Yeah.
Warren, because
Yeah.
thanks to you, I was able to participate in the Association of Responsible Citizenship Conference, the second one they had. You've
Yeah.
been to both.
Yes.
Maybe just tell us, what is ARC? What was your experience this year, maybe?
My take on ARC is it has created a unique gathering point in the world for, sort of a cross section of thinkers, leaders, politicians, community activists that are coming at the question, interestingly, I think, with a much more faith-centered view of the world. And I don't know if that is ultimately intentional. When I talked with the Strouds, who are sort of two of the big architects, Jordan Peterson being one of the others, I don't know that that was express in their objective, but I also think that they are very focused on, very similar to what we were just talking about, like really trying to get to the root of the truth. Like, what is the world actually about? Where are we actually going? There's a lot of discussion around, what are the tenets and the foundations of successful long-term sustaining civilization? And this need to get, I think, a much more of a moral framework around society. I think there's a bit of a rejection on relativist approach to things, and really trying to just get to the core. I think that's partly why I find it so fascinating. Is it is a real attempt to explore the truth, however we arrive at it, however we define it. And I think that obviously this is the Catholic in me that says that I think when you go on a journey to really genuinely try explore the truth as it is, not as you would like it to be, it's very hard to get away from God.
Right.
And I think you and I had talked about one of the things that really stood out to me in the second arc, and it was there in the first, but was very present in the second, was the sheer presence of the religious communities, and particularly the Roman callers in the room. There was a very noticeable uptick in the presence of God in the room. And, maybe that's a confirmation bias. I will freely admit that may be possible. But my sense was, I think that when you start to really get into these conversations that, sort of want to explore the idea of like, is there a morality? Is there an absolute good? Is there a right versus a wrong? And is it not arbitrarily set? I think it's really hard to get into those conversations without some acknowledgement of, well, how do you get to morality? Like, where does that, sort of moral code come from? If you believe in the existence of good and the existence of evil, I think when you chase those ideas back to their root, honestly, I don't know how you get there without the existence of God. I actually don't think it's possible. I'm fascinated if there's people that can sort of reason that out, but it seems to me that that's kind of an inevitable conclusion of that exercise.
Yeah.
And so, I think on some level, you are watching that play out with people like, Dr. Peterson.
Yeah.
And it's been, on some level, very fascinating, to watch, certainly his family. And I imagine him as well go through that journey of, sort of exploration and understanding of, who we are, where we are, what we are.
Yeah.
I think that conference is a bit of an expression of that question writ large. So that's been my personal experience with it. I think that it's a fascinating cross section of, people from all over the world. I take some comfort knowing that it strikes me that, whether you are in Canada, whether you are in Mexico, whether you're in Ghana, whether you are, in Vietnam, London, Johannesburg, all over the world, we're all kind of facing down similar questions. I think that's maybe one of the great features of the conference is that you get this sense that the issues, the challenges, the ideas that we're grappling with as human beings are not unique to us. Like, for all the challenges and sort of questions we're grappling with in the Canadian context, Australia's dealing with it too.
Yeah.
And so I think that there's some real power in knowing you're not alone. And again, there's a faith bias in that, right? To me, that's the power of the Catholic Church. Everywhere you go in the world, there they are.
Yeah,
Right?
absolutely. I mean, my experience was different this year from last, because last year I was only able to watch the videos, but shortly after you got back, you and I had lunch or coffee or something, and we talked about it. And then experiencing it this year, and it was very noticeable to me that there was much more frequency and, dare I say, boldness even in proclaiming things of faith, and very comfortably. And it wasn't at a place, it wasn't at a turn. It was, part and parcel with the conversation. It was really, really good. And I mean, yeah, I agree with you 100%. Sam Harris has tried to navigate the good and evil without obviously a God lens, because he doesn't have that.
Yeah.
And frankly, when he does that, he's coming across as the least articulate you see Sam Harris, because he's a pretty articulate, powerful man. But you see, I think, these conversations happening. Like, a lot of people are making buzz right now about all of the, record-setting numbers of people coming into the faith this year through, baptism and whatnot at Easter. And, no one can point to a correlation between the church doing something different and this.
Yeah.
But I do think when you speak to the people that have gone through that, they are searching for a profound sense of meaning.
Yeah.
Not just community, but context for everything. And that ultimately leads you to God. And then you even see it, the evidence, I find, like in some of the more popular podcasts, like you look at Rogan, how many times does things navigate towards, ultimate good, ultimate evil, the God question, all that. Like, it's even happening and being played out there. So yeah, it's happening all over the place.
It's one of the great questions of life. I don't know where I read it or where it was said, but the reason why history repeats itself is because humans are humans, right? Like, we're hardwired with some of this stuff. These questions have been around for literally thousands of years.
Yeah.
And I think for me, and this is the convert in me that comes out, is what I've struggled with folks that are trying to navigate a lot of these big questions. And they start from the proposition of, I'm going to figure it out myself. One of the things that I find fascinating in that is that you have, let's call it at that point of reflection, 40 years of life experience, right? And so in those 40 years, you are going to elect to discount and disregard literally 2,000 years of combined collected knowledge of the faith in favor of, well, I read a book. So I've got the answer, let me tell you. There's a level of chutzpah there for sure that maybe could do with a dose of humility. And I think for me, that's one of the things that I grapple with on a lot of conversation with folks when they're trying to sort of wrestle with the concept of God. And they're choosing to leave all of this information, all of this insight, all of this thinking, that is built upon itself, layer over layer over layer, over quite literally millennia, off on the side. Like, I feel like that's just such a missed opportunity. And it's like, obviously my Catholic bias, biases me towards the Catholic Church. But I would say, I think anybody that is at least going through that exercise and leaning on the wisdom, of our forefathers, I think is at such a massive advantage, because we have so little time on the earth. Like, it's such a blink.
Yeah.
To choose to start, without a 2,000-year head start on the question seems like a missed opportunity. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
And that's probably, ironically, my parents, who are atheists, have instilled such a strong sense of, use the wisdom, use the books. Big, fans of reading. Like, my parents insisted that, every month we were at the library taking out 10 to 20 books. And I had to read, those books. I was just like, it was non-negotiable in the house. So the irony of ironies is they instilled the thought process that got me to, where I am today. And even with a family that didn't really have God centered in its life, he still found me.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's great. Love it. Now, before we leave the conversation about ARC.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm putting you up to this, but tell us how you got there. How did you get the invite?
I mean, it is the most tangential connection to ARC I could probably, I might be the most like, I got here by accident of all the people. Certainly in the first conference, I was like, I kind of snuck in the back door is the best way I would describe it. So the connection for me is there is a fellow who is originally from Vancouver. He is a tailor, and he now owns a very successful global sort of custom suit, custom clothier company, a company called LGFG. This guy named Dimitri Tukshar, the phenomenal human being. He's a larger than life personality, and he and I met very early on in our careers. And he was building his business, and I was building mine, and we've become friends over the years. And like we're very cut from quite literally different cloth. He knows that I'd follow Jordan Peterson and read some of his stuff. And so he had pinged me from Estonia, where he lives, and said, "Hey, I've just finished doing some, suits for Dr. Peterson. And he's having this conference coming up in a couple of months. And he said, if there's a couple of guys I know, I could invite them." And he said, "Do you want to go?" And I think it was in October of 2023, or is it 2024? No, it's 2023. It's October 2023. And it fell in like the most inconvenient window in my schedule. And I remember saying to my wife, I was like, this is like, kind of short notice. I'm going to go to London, and I'm going to try and sort of, it's going to be pretty brutal jet lag. And Andrea was like, "Are you going to regret not going? Like, that's a once in a lifetime ticket. You have no business being there, frankly." She's like, "I feel like maybe, you might want to consider going." And so she actually was the one that encouraged me to go. And I'm so glad I had no idea what it was. Like, I looked at the list of speakers, and I was like, oh, there's some, pretty interesting people on the list. And the Speaker of the House for the U.S., House of Congress was going to be speaking there. Some of our, sort of famous Catholics, were going to be there. Bishop Barron was going to be there. Like, there was some good names on the list, but I honestly had no idea what I was signing up for. And so I just went, and I just showed up, and I was blown away. Kind of, kept looking for someone I thought was going to ID me and kick me out, but I was there and had a great time. And so, one of those things where once you're in, they don't ask how you got there. Yeah. And so then they, I ended up the lawyer's dinner, which is at the Inns of Court. And so ended up chatting with the organizer for that dinner, who happened to be from Canada, happened to be Catholic, and turns out that the Catholic faith, I think, is actually only 1 degree of separation at this point if you're like very active in the faith. And we knew a lot of the same people. And so, we got chatting about stuff. And so, she had said, "Look, like, if there's folks that you think that, should be there, and if there's, folks that you think would be interested, let us know." And so that's how I had said, "Well, I think that, you and I have talked." And I said, "I think it would be really interesting if you were open to coming, see if we could get you an invite." So,
oh, absolutely.
Yeah. And then we flew across the continent together and hung out for a week and had a grand old time. So it was
awesome. Yeah. I so appreciate it. Thank you for that. Yeah. It pains me, but we're going to have to wrap up. That just means I'll have to have you on, because I got other questions I want to ask you.
That was great.
Particularly around political scenes and new popes being named and all that. But we'll have to save that for another day. But why don't you just tell us, like, what's on the immediate horizon? Anything worth saying that's exciting?
I mean, I think for me, it's just the continued growth of the business. So we've been very fortunate. We went from a small sort of, ragtag breakaway group in Vancouver 5 years ago to now having a company that's got offices in Vancouver and Calgary and Toronto. We are, as I described it, King of Door is one of the largest legal recruitment firms now in Canada, which is kind of a weird statement, sort of almost overnight, it feels like. And so a lot of my world is, traveling the country, meeting with heads of groups, heads of firms, general counsel. So obviously, any of those folks ever want to chat, I'm always open, to suggestions. So certainly keep us in mind. And yeah, if there's folks that are interested in the St. Thomas More Lawyers Guild, if you're in the profession, if you know folks, friends, kids, parents, grandparents that are somehow maybe not aware of it, or are interested to get involved, please, reach out to myself, reach out to Bruno DeVita, Robert Piazantine is a partner at Macmillan. We're all always looking to, include people and bring them into the conversation.
That's awesome. I know you're quite active on LinkedIn, so people can find you there. Warren Smith, the company name, Smith Legal Search, right?
Yes.
Smith
Yes.
Legal Search, so people can find you online. Warren, thank you. Thanks so much for doing this. Thanks for all that you are, all you represent, all you're doing. It's an inspiration, and it's a joy to know you. So appreciate you coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Listeners, I know this was a blessing to you, and until next time.